Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Blarney Books. And before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on Gunditjmara country, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and note that the lands that we're on were never ceded. It's a very special occasion tonight. Aside from being a book launch, 2 book launches, which makes it doubly exciting, but also it's a birthday party tonight, I believe. Blarney Books is 18. It can now vote, drink and drive. Not all at the same time. You shouldn't vote and drive, that's just silly. Yeah, so that's happening after this. So if you can stick around, there's nibbles and there'll be drinks and there'll be people telling lots of tall tales, I'm sure, as you would expect in a bookshop of this esteem. But before we get to that, we have 2 books to launch locally. I know that they've been launched in other places. Your book, Margaret, came out like 6 months ago or 7 months ago? Or?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So you're already well over this. You're on your way into your next book. But so tonight we are launching Purgatory, as you can see with the big poster at the back, by Robert Smith. For those of you who turned up hoping to see the lead singer from The Cure, I'm very sorry. Have you heard that joke many times? Yes, okay, good. I was really going to say something beforehand and say, can I make The Cure joke? But I just thought, no, I'm just going to go for it. It's easier to beg forgiveness and ask for permission. So Purgatory, a crime story set in regional Victoria, and Stonetown by Marg Hickey, another crime story set in regional Victoria. Victoria or South Australia? South Australia. It doesn't explicitly say, but you know it's somewhere near the border there. Yeah. So, to get things started, Robert, if you'd like to go first, just give us the short blurb on Purgatory.
Purgatory concerns a young policeman who has left Ballarat under fairly dubious circumstances that we don't find out about until well into the book. And he's sent to the country town of Manangatang as the sole policeman, where he believes that he will spend his next few years in purgatory, and it'll probably bring the end to his career that he had set out before him, that he thought was just a natural progression until he was in the homicide squad. And there's a historic event up there that he investigates, but it also leads into a murder, which he has a fair bit to do with solving. But it's also just as much about living a life in those remote regions with massive heat in the middle of summer and
yes,
mouse plagues and everything else. So it's I tend to think that the remoteness and the climate are probably as big a characters as anybody in the book.
Margaret, Stonetown is a sequel to Cutter's End, but tell us about Stonetown.
So Stonetown is, yes, it's a sequel, but it's also a standalone, and it's about Marg Hickey, the detective. He's returned home because his mother has died, and he loved his mother. He loved his mum so much, and he's so sad. So he's back in his mother's house, and a real estate agent is shot in the bush, which makes some people sad and some others not so sad. So it sort of highlights the tree changes and the urban divide and the land, sort of the land grab in the country. At the same time, there's a crime of national significance, and that's a young policewoman has gone missing, and every police station, everyone in the country is transfixed by this missing case, and these two sort of collide in Stonetown.
And your story is very much about the community as well, and I think in the notes at the back you say it's sort of dedicated to the country women who keep small towns alive, basically.
Yeah, and they do. I actually lived for a few years in Patchy-Wallock in the Mallee, so I know all about mouse plagues, putting buckets under your bed so that mice don't crawl up your bed. Now I live in Beechworth, but the majority of my time has been in small country towns. But always, it has been the country women that I remember most. And that's not to say anything about the men, but the men were often, as a child to me, less visible. They were mustering, they were shearing, they were crutching, they were stripping wheat, they were all those sorts of things, milking, whatever region we lived in. And so it was the women who I got to know and the women who seemed to organise most things around the town and really, that really got to know and love, really. So it is a tribute to them.
Now, Robert, you've set your book in the very real place of Manangatang. Margaret, yours is in the... I had to just double check that it is actually fictional because it feels like a real place, but Buralama, which I've just said with as broad an accent as I can. So there's obviously some decision-making that's going on in both of your heads there. Rob, tell me why you chose a real place.
I think I chose a real place because Judy and I were up there for 10 years, so I know it really well. I think I got on really well with the people up there, and Judy coached their netball team to a couple of premierships after a long drought, and I was the president of the tennis club for many years.
The tennis club does play a major role in the story as well.
Yeah, the good player that's in there is actually me. No, I picked Manangatang for a number of reasons. That I knew that I could name that town and it'd still be fairly positive for people up there. Although a few people did ask me early on, why did I call it Purgatory? The book Purgatory, and I said that's simply because the policeman thought that was going to be his lot, but he was totally surprised, and in the end he didn't really want to leave after staying up there for 12 years. And the other thing is Manangatang is one of those places that people have heard of before. There's an old saying, and I've got this in the book, they used to say they're racing at Manangatang. In other words, somewhere around Australia there's a race meeting going on, and one of the commentators had said one time, and they're racing at Manangatang.
Yeah, I think there's actually a book called And They're Racing at Manangatang.
Yes, yeah. Written by Adam McNichol, who's a good friend of ours. In fact, he was a little tacker when I was teaching at school. And he's 40 now, which is a worry.
But did you have a moment where you thought, I can't call it Manangatang?
That did go through my head. The other thing I was going to say too is Lou Richards used to say this Carlton or South Melbourne or whoever was at the time couldn't beat the Manangatang thirds.
Yeah.
So it carries its own sort of status in a sense. But there were times when I thought, is it insulting to set it there? And a lot of the characters are based on people I knew, and some of them, the people up there will straight away say, I know who that is. But none of them are any of the malevolent characters. None of them are anybody that I've in any way had a go at or wrote negatively about. It's always been in a positive sort of a way, which was what most of the people were up there. And if there were an occasional person that weren't that way, who wasn't that way, I wouldn't put them in.
Yeah, okay. But were you worried about any sort of bad backlash about any of that sort of stuff? Or, I mean, obviously you followed through on setting it in Manangatang, but did that worry you at all?
No, I don't think so.
No.
Don't think so. A couple of people said make sure you put Manangatang in the title, which is what Joe said about one that I've written that's set in Port Fairy. Yeah. But I didn't, but it becomes fairly obvious early on. There'll be people interstate, if there's people reading it interstate, who'll perhaps wonder where the hell Manangatang is. Yeah. It's pretty easy to picture on the map where it is from the way you sort of explain in the book, but have you done a Manangatang launch for the book yet? I'd have a lot of trouble scratching up enough people for a launch, but... I just feel like everyone in Manangatang would buy a copy though, wouldn't they? They have. Oh, they have? They have already? Okay. Don't need a launch then. It's all job's done. there was a little gift shop. Perhaps I should go back just one step. When we were up there, you could buy anything you wanted in Manangatang unless you wanted to buy a couch or a new car. 20 years before that, you could have bought all those things. You see pictures of the town, there's car dealers, there's all sorts of people. When we went up there just recently, there's a fish and chip shop. The pub, the Menang pub, is always, it'll never close down because when it got burnt down one time, they sold beer off trestles in the street. There's a couple of chemical places, ag chemicals, but there was a little gift shop that a lady, a farmer's wife, started, and she sold a lot of books. Yeah.
And Marg, Burulama, I keep going to say Bullarama, but it sounds like a festival or something. Burulama, firstly, is that an analogue for somewhere, or did you just go, no, I need a completely fictitious place and I'm just starting from scratch, building my own town?
Yeah, Rob's much braver than me. I don't include real. I include real place names around the name, but the central place where the crime takes place, I always change the name. And it is not. I mean, Stonetown is probably loosely borough in South Australia. Cutter's End is, most people will pick it as Cooper Pedy, but I'm too scared to do it. And you know, there's a few reasons for that. One author that I know wrote a book, a crime novel set on a town in the New South Wales coast. I won't name the book or the author, but she called it by the new town, and the backlash was really terrible. Mind you, she did put all her most evil, depraved characters in the town, and the backlash it really went against her, I think. And I didn't want to. My towns are sort of more. If I name them as not the real name, then they become kind of generic or representative of small towns. So that was where I was going for, not so specific. The regions are always very specific, but the actual place names, no, I'm too nervous to do that.
Yeah, because that's the other thing. You could probably point out where Burulama would probably be on a map. Yeah. But I mean, I'm guessing because you've lived in a lot of places in regional Victoria, do you feel like there's parts of those places you've lived that sort of all kind of come together to make Burulama?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the reason why the books are set in South Australia is the first book, Cutter's End, is starts off with hitchhikers up and down the Stuart Highway, that wonderful highway that cuts the nation in two. And I know that highway because I've hitchhiked up and down it many times when I was younger, and it was a great place to set a crime novel. But then when I made my cop, Marg Hickey, investigate, I was so stupid I didn't realise that police couldn't swap jurisdictions. Uh-huh. So they said the publisher said you either have to make him a South Australian cop or a federal cop. So I started to try and write him as a fed, and I felt like I was plagiarising Jane Harper or something. I couldn't do it, so I moved it all to South Australia.
So now you're locked in South Australia.
And now I'm locked in. Well, I've got one more. The third one's, but they're all sort of close to the Victorian border. So the third one is set in the Limestone Coast. So I can easily go across there.
Yeah. Come over to Portland or Port Fairy, perhaps.
Port Fairy.
Yeah. Now, what I noticed about each of your books is that they're both very much crime books, but the way the plots sort of move are quite different. Yours, Rob, I'd say is more of a slow burn throughout it, whereas Marg, yours feels more like a very it's like right on you right from the get go. So I've got to know: are you both plotters or pantsers? Have you guys heard those terms before?
Yeah.
Yeah. Are you a plotter or a pantser, Rob?
Please explain.
Well, a plotter plans it all out beforehand, and a pantser does by the seat of the pants and just sort of starts at the start and rolls through.
I'm a bit of both, I think. I know how it's going to end,
mm-hmm.
but getting there is I sort of make it up as I go along. I've got a reasonable idea of how I'll go, but then I'll have a great idea halfway through. And then I'll have to go back and rewrite a heap of stuff to make sure that is consistent.
Yeah.
But always, always knowing how the end's going to look like. But I suppose in that sense, I'm a bit of a plotter. But the rest of it's just seat of my pants. You know, when I start a new chapter, I might have scribbled out what I think might be in there, whether there's a couple of interviews with the police, or there's a young girl in my book called Yvonne who is very much central to the plot. A pretty rough around the edges city girl who ends up in Menang, or Menangatang, and I sort of know where she's heading down the track, but there's other bits that come in that I sort of drag them in as I go.
And Marg?
I wish I was a plotter. I really do, because the way I write is so inefficient, really. But because it worked with Cutter's End, I thought I'm going to try it with Stonetown. And what I do is I start off with a landscape, always a landscape that I know quite well. And from there, I think kind of an opening scene, and then I write a paragraph, and then the next time I sit at my desk, I write the next paragraph. I read that one, and then I read that one, and then I read that one. And with Cutter's End, I found out who the murderer was at about 70,000 words. and at Stonetown, I was getting towards like 68,000, and I still didn't know who. I had some ideas, of course. You know, I had red herrings, who they would be, but I was panicking. And this is what I did, what I'm doing at the moment, kind of with my current one. But I was panicking, and I woke up in the night, and I had a nightmare that I had to put Angela Merkel in the book, and I don't even know why. I've got no connection to German politics, but so that I panicked. But I've just got to trust the process, and it has worked. And at some point, when I sit down and then I write the next paragraph, and then I write the next paragraph, I can see it. I can see how it would work. With the one I'm just writing now, I'm into the edits, but I rang up my publisher the other day and I said, is it too late to change who the killer is? and I could hear her scream almost, silently down the phone. But that's how I work, and I've just got to trust it.
I guess the advantage to that is you're not going to just like make it obvious who the killer is from the start, because if you don't know, then you're sort of finding out as you go along. Like,
yeah, and then when I find out who it is, I'm like, oh wow, this person, and it's a great joy. It's a joy. Every paragraph is a joy. When I was writing literary fiction for years for literary journals, and when I wrote my book of short stories, I found them torturous. And all credit, hats off, and we've got some brilliant authors, in the audience here, Alison and Christine, and they will know, I find that sort of literary writing really difficult, but with this one, every day is a joy that I sit down to write at the desk.
and so when you finally have your eureka moment, then how much is, like Rob sort of says about having to go back and put stuff in, how much are you having to go back and change things then? Once you
I have to go back and change it. I mean, when I get my edits back, for my structural edit from the edits, it is a soul-destroying moment. Like I have no ego. It's like someone's just, But I do have to go back and change things. But they're so good, the editors and the publishers. Their job is to illuminate the work, and I trust them. And they're the professionals. They've been doing this for years, so they invariably make the work a better work, and I'm really grateful to them.
Mm. And this sort of leads into the next question, I guess. But editors and publishers, they are going to really know the genre as well.
Yeah.
And writing in the crime genre, there are very real conventions and expectations that readers have. So, how much do you feel you can? We'll start with you first, Marg. But how much do you feel you can sort of subvert that kind of thing, or do you feel like you just have to kind of adhere to those conventions and expectations all the time of the genre?
That is such a great question, Matt, and it's actually one of my favourite questions, and I've thought about it a lot, because when I was lecturing at uni, I lectured in genre literature, mainly Gothic literature, so I sort of thought, will I write crime or Gothic. And I love conventions. I love, there's real comfort, you know, and Joe here has got music, science. There's real comfort in knowing that you're going to take a book from a certain shelf and you won't know the storyline, you won't know the plot line, but you'll know that there's some key things. Most often it's changing, but there's a troubled male protagonist. Most often the inner life will merge with the crime. The landscape will mix with the crime as well. There'll be at least 3 red herrings. You know, these things happen, and I am conscious of them, but I don't necessarily stick to them. But always at the end, when I'm writing rural crime, I can see, you know, when I read Rob's book, there's going to be real similarities with mine, and there's comfort in that. And you can, of course, you can play around with that, but there are those conventions that are good.
And Rob, what about you? I mean, this is your first crime novel, isn't it? So I assume you had some sort of awareness of the genre and you knew what you were kind of doing. So how much of that was adhering to expectations and the conventions of the genre, or trying to do something different?
Excuse me. No, I think that I pretty much tried to write something that I thought that I'd like to read myself. So I'd read all Jane Harper's books, yep. But I also, my favourite author anywhere is probably James Lee Burke, an American writer who writes about life in the South in America, and he writes so much of his writing is imagery. He talks about visiting the bayous, and I've never been to the bayous, but I'm nearly there. Yeah. You know, like the frogs and the sounds and everything. And I tried to incorporate a bit of that, and certainly the first chapter, I suppose, of mine is you know, the constable, the new constable, and his lady friend driving towards Manangatang on the worst possible day you could. And all I was really doing was describing the day that Judy and I went to Manang. Yeah. And we just thought, what the hell have we got into? There was a roaring dust storm. There were roly-polies bouncing over the top of the car. When we got to the school, there was a gigantic water fight happening. Everybody was running around. This was the day you get the year before, so you could go and visit the school and work out your housing and what your allotment's going to be. And these guys running around in their jocks throwing water on each other, and then I realised that was the staff. And then we thought, my God. But anyway, we had a couple of worse days, but that was life up there. We had a girl one time at the start of a year when we'd been up there for a few years. I won't say what her name is, but it's forever encrusted in my brain. She'd been appointed to the school and she was looking for somewhere to live, and there was virtually nowhere to live, but there was a farmer's house that was available. He'd moved somewhere else. And I thought, oh, I'll take her out and show her that. Anyway, we went out there. Nobody had lived in it for probably 6 months. The back door was wide open. The kitchen was filled with sand. And anyway, I said, you don't have to live here. There's one of the other teachers said, you can stay at our place until something better comes available. And when we drove back into town, you just could not see for dust. This big dust storm roared in from the west. When we got into town, the street lights were all on. You couldn't see much further than the front of the car. And I dropped her off in the car park where she was going to drive around to this other couple's place, where she was going to have tea and stay with them. And about 7:30, the guy that was supposed to be hosting her for tea rang up and said, is Debbie still with you? And I said, no, I dropped her off heaps ago. And he said, well, I've driven around town, I just can't find her. She must be lost. And anyway, about 8 o'clock that night, there was a call from Bendigo from her father saying, my daughter's here and she's not coming back. So she didn't even see the kids. And that's what you're confronted with. And Margaret's the same at Patchawallic. We're talking about the mouse plague before. But they go into folklore in a sense. And one of the reasons I wrote this book was when we left Menang and then we were posted to Ararat, I used to keep recalling all these stories. This happened up in the Mallee, this happened. Somebody said, well, why don't you write them down? And I thought, if I just write one of those things where this happened, that happened, it's not going to be very interesting. But I thought if I can have a murder in the town with a policeman and he experiences all these things that I just experienced or we experienced all the way through as part of our daily lives, that'd make it a lot more interesting. And that's what a lot of people that have read it have said. They said, I'm actually there, I can feel that I'm there. And that's what I tried to do. There was a spanner in the works last year because somebody said to me, nobody ever gets murdered in Menangatang. And then last year on the news, murder in Menangatang. This is about a month before the book's due to come out. And but anyway, they found the guy. He was an itinerant guy that they caught him fairly quickly up in Albury. So
did you genuinely think, I'm going to have to hold off the publication of this because it's a bit too close to home?
No, I didn't think that. I thought that people are going to think he's cranked out a bit of a story of this guy within a month of him being killed.
Could have boosted book sales then.
Well, it could have, or the police might have knocked on the door too. Yeah.
You've mentioned Jane Harper, who of course, I think probably everyone in this room has probably read The Dry. And James Lee Burke, but there's some other writers, because you were diving into something you hadn't really done before, were there some other crime writers that you read just as research or just to get your head around it? Or
I just for fun, I often, I'll read Michael Connelly's books when they come out. And also, James Lee Burke. He skipped my mind. The guy that wrote...
Patterson.
Sorry?
Patterson?
No. The guy that wrote The Pelican Brief.
John Grisham.
John Grisham. I should know. There's a book sitting on our place in Regent Street here where we live. My daughter must have left it for me, John Grisham. And I like his work too. The only thing I don't enjoy about John Grisham is at the end he often punches you in the guts, you get to the end and then it doesn't work out the way you want it to, but then you realise, well, perhaps that is the American justice system.
Yeah, it's real life, folks.
Yeah.
Marg, what about, you said before that you were kind of tossing up whether you would do gothic or crime. What swayed you to go to crime, and were there some writers that influenced the way you approach things or the way you write?
Yeah, there are. So my PhD was in depictions of landscape in Australian literature. So I was really interested in how Australia was depicted from since white settlement. I'm talking predominantly white writers here. But, from a really early time from the settlers came, they wrote about Australia in really disparaging terms. So it's only up until really the 60s or 70s that Australian white writers started writing about the land with affection or with love. People try and say to me Henry Lawson, but Henry Lawson did not write about the Australian landscape in affectionate terms. It was better when the moonlight shone on it, boring, mundane, monotonous, good for a week, not good for a year, all this sort of thing. He loved the people, and I love Henry Lawson, by the way, but the landscape he wrote about very disparagingly. Banjo Patterson was more romantic, but he was predominantly in Sydney. So I found that really interesting. So Barbara Bainton, I think Barbara Bainton is truly underrated. She was there around the same time as Henry Lawson, and she wrote from a woman's point of view what it was like in the bush. So she wrote a short story in response to The Drover's Wife, which is called The Chosen Vessel, and I think it's one of the most frightening stories I've ever read. It's about a young woman with her child at home in a hut. Her husband's off droving. He's horrible. He's a horrible man. And a swaggy comes around and is scratching at the doors trying to get in. And it's really frightening. So Barbara Bainton, of course, you know, Kenneth Cook, Wake in Fright, is a genius, is absolutely a genius in Australian horror. And I'm talking kind of gothic horror too, you know, that outback as almost a supernatural force out to get you. But my favourite crime writer, and I actually don't read much, I'm really conscious when I'm writing, I don't read any crime because I'm terrified of plagiarising, but my favourite crime writer would have to be Peter Temple. And I feel so sad that Peter Temple's died because I would have liked to say how much his work meant to me. He, for the first time, I think, wrote a crime novel, and one of them, of course, The Broken Shore, was set here, and it was really beautifully written. So he would be my favourite one, but I don't read. I put a ban on crime when I'm writing. Yeah.
I think that I should have mentioned Peter Temple too, because the thing I liked about Peter Temple is in his novels, he wasn't scared to stray off just the crime. You know, they'd go to the races or they'd be at the pub in Fitzroy, and that sort of thing I liked about it, because it sort of gives you an idea of who the people are involved and other interests outside what's happening, rather than just a straight policeman, you know, yes, no, sort of thing.
Yeah, it's a bit of colour to go with the
and also,
hard news. I
should have mentioned A Picnic at Hanging Rock too, because, you know, like...
Well, that's gothic as well.
And again, the landscape is supernatural.
But the landscape nearly becomes the most important character in the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I...
which both of your books has done, and again, you know, and Jane Harper's The Dry really does that as well. But both of your books are very conscious of the environment and how much of a character that is. And you sort of mentioned about working on that quite a bit right from the start. How much do you worry you're going to do too much with that? I mean, can that become distracting, do you think, in a book sometimes?
Too much of that stuff outside the actual storyline. I think if it fits, it's okay. You know, there's a scene in my book where Greg Bowker's out on a side road waiting to see if a car's going to go and pass from a guy he suspects might be tied up in all of this. And a goanna comes up on the bonnet of his car, and he talks about, and he thinks about, he's in an old Peugeot because he doesn't want to be recognised, and that's his own car, and he talks about this French icon in the middle of in the bush, and yet it fits in because it's a bottle greeny colour. And I was quite happy there to talk about him sitting there in the bush with the windows down. This is before the goanna crawled up, but I mean, and talking about, you know, birds in the trees and a few insects flitting. I didn't quite get to the stage of Picnic at Hanging Rock where all the ants are crawling everywhere, because it's one of my favourite films, but my kids just give me heaps, you know. It should be on the Nature Channel, Dad, watching ants do this, but I like that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think as long as and it has to in crime novels, the landscape, because and we're talking rural crime, which is a separate genre in itself, so it's very different from other types of crime. So it's not an Agatha Christie, a living room crime, for example, which is different. But if rural crime, the landscape must be in there, but it must always move the story forward. So if there's a dust storm, what is that? Does that signify confusion? Is that people getting lost? If there's a heat, well, that's sort of the heat can, you know, signify rising anger, that sort of stuff. So always, no, I don't worry about putting too much of it in, because it is a character, and it's the lens really through which rural crime is all written.
One difference I noticed in between each of your books is that the settings feel kind of similar, but the eras you've set them in are different. So, Rob, yours is set in the 80s, I think in the early 80s, I think.
Yep.
And Marg, yours is set in contemporary times. All of those, where you choose to set it and when you choose to set it are both very important things. But Rob, why did you set yours in the early 80s?
That was the time that we were up there teaching. So when I was writing, a lot of it I could see in my mind. There's a bit in there about trotting horses, and so all that happened. You know, I used to work horses for this guy up there, and it was all very natural to write it at that stage. And something Margaret's probably come across too is that one of the great values of writing before mobile phones
Yeah, well, that was where I was going to go with this. Yeah.
is that you can have things happening and then something happening afterwards. My next novel, this particular novel, everything's solved, but there is something happens right at the end, which is the basis. It doesn't impact on purgatory at all, but it sets the scene for the next novel when this Senior Constable Greg Bowker is now in the homicide squad, and he's called back to Manangatang in the modern day for this crime that's hinted at the end of purgatory. And so I was able to do it as it now, when it's a town which is dead, the population's gone, farms, 10,000 acres. When Judy and I moved up there, there was a full primary school. Each of the year levels in the high school had 2 classes, except for year 11 and 12, but you know, year 7s and year 8s each had 25 each. There was a Catholic school in the town as well. By the time we'd left, that had dropped right away. I hope there's no connection, but anyway, that they dropped right away. And now, you know, the whole school's got about 60 kids in it from preps right through to year 12. So they are 2 different towns, but I set my first one in that time because I knew it really well. And just getting back to the mobile phones, I had a situation where they'd gone out to a shearing shed and interviewed a shearer, then gone back into town to interview his wife, and that's okay in the 80s.
Yep.
But now, you know damn well he's going to get on his phone and ring her.
Yeah.
So I'm sure Margaret...
Yeah, mobile phones have really made crime writing difficult. They really
They've ruined
have.
horror movies, they've ruined crime novels.
Yeah, but also what's made crime writing great in the current is CCTV footage, because we've got mobile phones now that are a pain in the neck because people are going to be on their phones and ringing, taking photos. But if you're at a loss for how someone finds someone, you can say, shouldn't there be CCTV footage outside the pub's car park? And then there can be this whole setting when they're looking at the screen and they see a grainy image of someone walking past. So, and when I was talking, I was up in Sydney for the Crime Writers Festival there, and Gary Jubilan was interviewed. He was the cop who, the whole William Tyrrell policeman in that case. But he was saying that nowadays, how they solve crimes, you would think it would one of the biggest factor in solving crimes, and I'm talking, you know, like those sort of crimes, or the couple that went missing in the one in Gutter Valley, for example, those ones that were murdered there, is CCTV footage. So that's what that is the number one thing. So that has been a real boon. I love that. Yeah, mobile phones, not so much. And also I ran into a problem because of COVID. So I had to make a decision, do I write with people? And I said, no, I'm not going to have characters with masks on their faces, or I've ignored COVID, and that was a conscious decision, and I just wanted to forget it. Those masks.
No, well, I did exactly the same thing, because I was faced with exactly that same thing, and I thought, this is so current, you know, and I knew there were a lot of people writing novels about COVID, you know, like sort of plague novels or whatever, and I was the same. I wanted to write it in the modern day, but just in the modern day without that constraint. And I agree with you about CCTV TV, and credit cards can be tracked everywhere. Mobile phones, ping towers everywhere.
Yeah,
So
you've got a phone pinging in yours.
Yeah, I've got a phone pinging.
And I have totally fixed a problem in the book I'm working on at the moment by putting CCTV footage in it. It's funny. I did a panel with some other writers, and we were talking about whether to set things during COVID, and everyone went no. Because everyone assumed at some point it'd be over, because it's over apparently. And so it really locks it to a particular time period. Whereas I suppose you've set yours in a particular time period, but Marg, with yours, you could theoretically pick that up in 10 years' time and think it's still contemporary.
Yes, and that was a conscious decision, yep.
And there's other things too about like hacking into computers and checking financial records and things like that. So I guess they become tools that you can use. Yeah. But for you, Rob, like you have to really go back to, I guess, old school police work. Did you have to do any research around that to make sure that you didn't get ahead of you in the time sense?
Oh, absolutely. When did they start using breathalyzers?
Yeah.
What sort of cars were they driving at that time? Luckily, a friend of ours in Ararat, she's a recently retired policewoman, and I said, was that the age when they had Studebakers? She said, oh God, that was years before that, and so on. So she was able to help with those, but you're right. But, little things like a very important part of my book, important scene, relates to the school social. And for kids to talk to their parents, they had to walk down the street to the public telephone box. Yep. And that becomes important to the story. Whereas now, they'd all be sitting in there taking photos of each other inside. The whole thing probably wouldn't work the way I'd written it if it was in the modern time now. Yeah.
And Marg, you have a lot of police procedural sort of stuff in yours. Do you have a go-to retired cop like Rob does that you can run this stuff by, or are you just watching countless episodes of CSI?
Yeah, no, I didn't have a cop. So in the first edit, I had lots of mistakes with cops. But one time I thought I'm going to ring the Cooper Pedy police station for Cutter's End, and I rang and I said, oh, hi, I know this sounds really stupid. If you've only got a few minutes, could I speak to you about some crime because I'm writing a book? And he went, what? Like he was sort of, and he said, no, we're very busy. We're too busy here. We've got there's a lot going on. We're a 15-man station. 5 of us have been called out. And I said, can I just ask you about ranking? Oh. And anyway, he told me, and then 2 hours later, he was still on the phone, like telling me, and then every few minutes he'd say, oh, I have to go, there's something, and then he'd go, and by the way, and that's one thing. I think it's so wonderful. People are so generous with their time. The other day we were at, Mum and Dad and I were at Piccaninny Ponds, and because my next book is is about cave diving, and a cave diver came, and we said, oh, hi, what's it like down there? And he told us all about it, and then, I'm not joking, and the next moment a South Australian policeman walked out, a really handsome one, and we were going, oh my God, is that Marguerite? And he let it, and people are so generous with their knowledge. I'm really impressed. It helps to have a brother-in-law who's a mechanic, because it's always good to know how to blow up cars or what sort of cars. But I've found if you ask people, they're so generous with their time.
And it saves you from having to go spelunking then, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
You haven't been tempted to, just for the research?
I haven't been tempted. Snorkelling over them, reading about them, talking to them.
Not swimming down into them?
Not myself, no. Not under caves, no.
Yeah, we had a situation on Facebook one time where I got this message on Facebook from the Menangatang community page, and it said, it was from a name, I had no idea who it was. And I said to my wife, I've got no idea who this is, and it said, I've private messaged you, and I don't know much about Facebook, so I had to work out what did it mean to be private message. But anyway, it was the guy that his name was in Facebook was in fact just his Christian name and his second name, and he left off his surname as his Facebook.
Was he a Nigerian prince?
Pardon?
Because I get them.
However, who he really was the policeman in Menangatang when I was working there as a teacher, and he said, for obvious reasons, I don't put my full name on Facebook. And so he said, oh, I'm really looking forward to it and everything. And then I messaged him back and said, I hope I've done you proud, and please close your eyes to any police procedural matters that I've given you more or less power than you really had. So that was good. Yeah.
How much of an influence was that actual copper on Greg Bowker?
Not very much.
Okay.
Not. Oh, look, all those local coppers are those little country towns. There's one cop. They walk a really difficult tightrope.
Yeah.
Right, and there's a scene in the Menang pub early on where Bowker's got to make up his mind what he's going to do about these guys in the pub. Is he going to be the guy that walks in there and everybody thinks, oh, we've got a real mongrel for a cop? Or do they say this guy's a pushover? And so there were a couple of policemen when we were up there, and both of them walked that line very well. They were in the community, you know, part of the footy club and everything. If they needed to pull anybody, you know, there's hardly any crime up there, and so was virtually no drugs or anything in those days. Alcohol was a big problem. But when they needed to give the local boys a razz up in town, they'd go and work at Robinvale on Saturday night. The Robinvale cops would come to Menang, rip through everybody, and then the next day the Menang blokes would say, God, we're glad we don't have those blokes from Robinvale, you know. And he looks like the hero, and yet it was probably him and rang them up and said, look, you better come down and do a bit of a job on these guys, you know.
Yeah. That's the kind of police procedural stuff that actually makes it feel more real. You can get away with faking, I think, a lot of the actual cop procedure stuff, but it seems like that actually are details that make it seem more realistic, because that's how it would actually work.
Yeah, and the other thing is you've got to take into account the policemen up there had their wives with them as well. Now, if they're going to be, you know, a mongrel to everybody, then that often rebounds that often it'll be usually the men in the district who don't like the cop, and then they might say to their wives that cop's a mongrel, whatever, and then, you know, you don't know whether, you know, the wife of the cop, you know, it might be a female cop nowadays, but not in the 80s. So you've got to take into account what's going to be the impact on the policeman's family, because we had a teacher from overseas that the only time I ever saw our policeman come to the school was when this overseas teacher, one of his daughters was, I don't know what she's doing, in woodwork, and he hit her over the head with a bit of 4B2, and that's the only time I saw the cop at the school. Yeah.
I know that there's a few writers in the audience, and whenever I'm at one of these things, I always want to know how you got to the point where this comes out. So this is the important question for a lot of people here. But Marg, this is your second book, but tell us about the path to publishing that you had, well, certainly for Cutter's End.
Yeah, well, I've been writing for years and years and years, and being rejected for years and years and years, and the short stories that I'd written had won sort of some national awards, some state awards. They were published in literary journals, but no one read them. You know, no one read them, and that's hard sometimes. And then with Cutter's End, I published a collection of the short stories that won awards were published in a short story collection, and
that's Rural
Dreams, and now that's on the school curriculum in Year 10. Not every school, but and so that helped a bit. So then I started to feel a bit better about myself, and but with Cutter's End, when I started writing Cutter's End, I wrote it for no one else. I thought if it flies, it flies. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And then I wrote it. I didn't really tell anyone. It wasn't academic. I didn't try to be clever. I didn't try to, impress anyone. I just wrote it. And then I am a member of the Australian Society of Authors, which I recommend everyone to be a member of if you're a writer, and they have literary speed dating. So I was set up, it was during COVID, with 3 publishers, I won't name them, but some good publishers, and the first screen, you have to pitch your novel in 3 minutes. And then the first one came up, and the publisher looked like that Richard Wilkins, remember him? He was sort of like, hi. And then the second one was so young. I thought, how did you get the job? And I wasn't very good. But the third one that came up was Penguin, and Bev Cousins, who is the head of crime in the UK as well as in Australia. And so she was the one I really wanted. And when the screen opened, it was a real kindness in a way, because when I came on, she leaned in. She leaned into the screen, and that's such a great, a great body language that told me that she was interested, and then that really relaxed me, and I was better in my pitch. But then afterwards, I think I was sitting with Dad in Port Fairy in our backyard, and she rang up and said, Penguin would like to make an offer, and then I got offers from the other 2 as well.
Wow.
But Penguin was no. First of all, they'd said that all 3 liked to see the thing, so I sent it all in, and then I got offers. But Penguin was the best one. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
And she was the best one for me.
Did they make a 2-book deal, 3-book deal, just for the one for Cutter's End?
I can't remember. Now. It's a bit of a blur. So they made... No, so that was just Cutter's End, and then when Cutter's End sold... So when it sells for Penguin over 10,000, then they start getting really interested. So then when that happened, they offered me a 2-book deal. So that's for Stone Town, and the next one, Broken Bay, that's out this year. And then since then, they've offered me, after Stone Town, when that started to do well, they've offered me 2 more. So for the next however many. So if you've got any ideas, I've got a new book due December the 23rd. So all ideas accepted. Yeah.
What about you, Rob? Yours is through Shoreline Publishing.
Yeah, Shoreline Publishing. Yeah, I sent it into a few of the big publishers. But what I was finding is often when you'd sign up to their little things that you send it in, they said that you had to tick that it was with no other, it wasn't being looked at by anybody else. And then often they'd say, we won't get back to you for so many months. And if you don't hear from us, you can assume that there's no go, which means you can sit there for months not knowing whether you're a no-go or not. And I did this for probably 3 or 4, I guess, some of the big ones. And then I heard on the radio one time, it sounds like you went through the right avenue with your speed dating, because I heard a guy on the radio say one time that some of the big publishing houses, they sort of have a stack where they throw all the submissions, and there's some derogatory term that they have.
Slush pile,
and then they'll say to an intern or work experience kid or somebody, have a sort through those and see what you think. Now, your future a little bit is in the hands of one person who perhaps looks at it and doesn't pass it on to somebody else. And I just happened to be in the Redan post office posting some stuff, just normal postage away, and sitting on the shelves in there were some books, and I looked at the spine and it was Shoreline Publishing. So I looked them up on the web, sent a submission in to them and thought, oh, well, I won't hear anything. And anyway, within a couple of weeks, they said, look, we're really, really interested. We'd like to meet you. And it went from there. And they've got there's 2 more in the process at the moment that'll publish. The next one is, there's one set in Manangatang, then there's another one set in Vanilla in the northeast, which is my hometown, which goes back a bit to when I was a kid. The same police officer goes back to his hometown.
Convention.
Yeah, yes, definitely.
But only as a bit of a fluke, as it turned out, and then the fourth one in Port Fairy. So it looks pretty promising on those fronts. The other thing that worried me a little bit was a lot of the big publishers, they asked how old you were. And, you know, I'm 73 years old, and they had in brackets, we like to establish a lifetime of publishing, you know. And I'm thinking to myself, geez, how much lifetime have I got left, you know? And also, how many friends do you have on Facebook and Twitter? Well, if you take my kids out of it, there's about 3. However, I did find that when I joined these groups like Port Fairy, where people might know me, Port Fairy, Manangatang, Mildura, Ararat, and these sort of things, suddenly all your stuff gets out to thousands of people.
Yep.
And the Shoreline stuff also goes into normal bookstores and everything else. So as well as getting them online, they are in bookstores. And I think I've had 3 radio interviews, which has stirred up a bit of interest as well.
Yep.
I should say that Purgatory has been nominated for Best Debut Fiction at the Independent Book Awards. I said to my kids, I said to my kids, I didn't think that I would debut anything at my age.
Never too late.
Unless it was guest of honour at my own funeral. That was about it. Yeah.
We've probably got some time for some quick questions from the floor. If there's any questions, if anyone's got any they'd like to ask. Yes.
I asked this interest because like Rob's cop is a male and he's a male, so that kind of, you know, maybe it makes sense to write from our perspective, but I was interested, were you ever wondering about writing a female cop?
So for those who listen to this as a podcast in the future, the question is, because you don't have a microphone, sorry, but the question is, Marg, did you think about writing a female cop, and what was it like to write a male cop as a woman?
Yeah, I get a lot of questions about that, and a lot of people actually email me about that too. I get probably about 5 emails a week from writers, and a lot of them is that question. And I haven't got a good answer for it. I don't have a good answer for it. I think... I don't know, because I love strong female characters. In a way, I should be the very person that's writing a strong female character. But I like Marg Hickey. I found him easy to write. I've got a good father, good brothers. I've got 3 sons, teenage sons. I'm surrounded by I've had the good fortune to be surrounded by good men in my life. I've got a lot of men sort of to draw on. And Marg Hickey, my character, is he's a good bloke. He's a good bloke. He's in his 50s. He's done quite well in his life, and he's beginning to understand, and Cutters ended in Stonetown, that perhaps by being a good bloke and a good footy player and having a strong handshake and being tall, that things have come a bit more easier to him than for the other policewoman, his colleague, who's a Sikh woman. So I think, and he's coming to realise that, and he's trying, and he's doing a good job, and I like him.
And there are some
there's
some interesting, strong female characters in Stonetown as well.
Yeah. Oh well, they're sort of everything, you know, about Stonetown. Stonetown is about the strong women in country town, and really, who rules the roost? Yeah. I mean, look at Joe there, you know, standing about you know, we've got and I like those characters, and I remember them. And you know, I was talking to my mum the other day about Ash Wednesday when we lived in Deans Marsh, and and my memory of this, you know, look, I was 11 or 12 or something, but when the fire came around the school, and my dad was the headmaster there, the men were at the farms or were off fighting fires or were at the mill or whatever, and when we were evacuated first to the school oval and then to the hall and then into the